All right, my friend, we have another question and topic from the community.
This is a great topic and one that I love as a question. It speaks to kind of my early beginnings when I was kind of dabbling into more serious training methods. I used to do a lot of training kind of in this vein. So I'm very excited to talk about this.
Okay, well, I'll read it for everybody at home. The question came in from Trevor S. And Trevor said, how would you communicate the importance of preserving or regaining the ability to jump to members? For example, the workout has box jump overs. How would you encourage someone to try scaling down a jump before just modifying it to a step over or something like that? The way I see it, if an athlete has the ability to produce enough power for a jump, even just over a line on the ground, it's still a huge sign in the right direction of their ability to stay functional as they age. Not to mention the other components of fitness being improved balance, coordination, strength, etc. that tend to follow plyometric training. Thanks, you guys. Like the content. So yeah, I sent this. This was sent to me, sent to you, and it fired you up immediately. So I was happy about that.
Yeah, for sure. Now let me start by saying it's Trevor, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I think he is right on in the way that he is thinking about this.
Right?
I think that he is assessing the situation with a very, very clear head. So right on, Trevor, for that right out the gate, because you are absolutely correct. Jumping and stepping over something are fundamentally different. And that doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but they are different, and therefore they're going to have a different impact on the individual. And it's important that you don't just start lumping them together in your mind, as so often is the case when people get so enamored by just training their engine. And that's the only thing that they really concern themselves with. So yes, it's a good idea to start separating the concept of jumping from just getting over something anyhow.
Mm-hmm. And in Trevor's question and his statements, kind of like you said, I was impressed with, he lays out the benefits of it. I think it's crazily going to be one of those times, like if your parents told you something and you didn't believe it because it was your parents, then you heard it from somebody else and you're like, oh, that sounds good. And your parents are like, I just told you that yesterday. I told you the same thing. I think,
Or how about this? I'll give you one of these. We've all had this experience where somebody close to you starts doing CrossFit and they're like, I just dropped into this gym and it was so great. And you're like, dude, I've been telling you this for 10 years. What?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So I think Trevor's got his head around it perfectly, probably explaining it to the members, and they're like, blah, blah, blah. And then lo and behold, one day, Adrian Bosman walks in and says the same thing. And the member goes, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I think I'll do that. So if you happen to walk in the midst of him having this conversation with the member and they're like, no, it's just the same. I'll just do a step up. And you were like, no, he's right. What would be your way to assist Trevor in explaining the benefits?
Well, this may be a slightly less popular opinion, Pat, but I don't think there's an explanation needed right out the gate. I think that a lot of times trainers get too wrapped up in they believe that they need to convince somebody rationally before they can engage in the activity or see the value in it. And honestly speaking, my approach many times throughout my coaching career was like, hey, Sally, great to see you today. Today, you're going to be jumping onto this 6-inch riser. Okay, great. And they just do it. And that conversation comes after the fact. The benefits of it, the kind of the theory and the rationale, that can wait. Just tell them what they're going to do today. And then, if there's some resistance in there, I think that's your job as a coach now to encourage that athlete and let them know that, hey, I've been with you from day one. I know what your abilities are, probably more so than you do. It's my job to keep tabs on these things. Trust me, you're at the level that this is appropriate. And if you have that trust and that relationship built, you should be able to coax that member, even if they're a little bit, reserved about it. You should be able to convince them that, hey, it's going to be okay. The convincing via rationale often isn't the easiest path forward because you have so many obstacles in your way. Number one, you have a member that they're probably already convinced that what you're telling them is wrong. So they're going to come into it with a framing that's difficult to overcome. Number two, you don't have time in the normal coaching session or class session to really get into that sort of theoretical discussion. So you're at a disadvantage there. Exactly, yeah. And number three, most people will believe their experience more so than they will believe some sort of diatribe. So the first time you get Sally to do a single jump to that riser that she was convinced that she couldn't do, immediately it's going to be a big switch. Now there's a success. Now we can move forward. None of that happens by thinking about it based on an argument that was made previously. The experience is way more powerful. So I'm of the opinion that, and maybe this is dodging the question a little bit, but I don't think your first strategy is to sit down and say, here's all the benefits of jump training.
And hopefully you've built up that trust with the client that if you say,
exactly,
look, I know you're a bit hesitant. I know maybe this seems whatever, unnecessary, scary, intimidating. We're going to find a nice, appropriately challenging jump, even if it's over a chalk line on the floor. It's up to the 2-inch thickness of a 45-pound plate, or it's a 10-inch box, whatever it happens to be. We're going to meet you where you are, but you're jumping today, my friend. We're gonna
exactly,
and even if we have to have you doing it safely with one hand on the upright of a bolted to the wall squat rack, so that you have this nice lifeline that you're always good and always in control. And then little by little you feel good and suddenly the hand's not there, but we're getting you jumping today. Trust me on this. You've been here for a while. Life's been good. You're getting fitter. I know what I'm doing. And here we go.
Absolutely. And I think the second strategy that I would employ, so number one, the experience is going to be key. And then second thing to keep in mind is how you administer that experience can have a huge range. And so to your point, it doesn't need to be an unsupported high jump right out the gate. It can be low. It can have a handhold for balance. It can be assisted. Not
to one of those back in the day, like how we used to do it in the garage in 2005, like those metal plyo boxes that have no sides with like razor sharp edges. If you miss one, you're going to the hospital.
Yeah, that's a little more advanced, but for the adventurous. But I think it's also important to remember that over the course of a session, where those jumps end up is also something you can play around with. Just because you want somebody to begin jumping doesn't mean that it has to be in the middle of a workout that's super high intensity and has a ton of reps and a bunch of accumulated fatigue. This could easily be something where you get a handful of reps during the warm-up. That starts to build some confidence. And then, a couple weeks later, as that has been introduced slowly, now you can get the toe in the water as far as a couple of reps in a more high intensity setting. It's that old adage of mechanics first, consistency, and then start to layer in that intensity. I mean, we talk about that all the time. So it's the same approach here. Don't feel like you have to throw that right into a workout.
So that was the second thing. You had 3 points. What was the third point?
Well, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the theory around why I think jumping has such utility.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep. Well, we can dive into that for now. I agree with what you're saying up to this point, and maybe you can get into some more the nuanced theory or whatnot. But in my reptilian, overly simplified mind, this won't be as polished as it should be. But as a general rule in strength and conditioning, it's always a good idea, again, this isn't polished, to try to hold on for dear life to as much complexity, as much of the advanced version of something for as long as you possibly can. And you only give that ground away, kicking, clawing, and screaming. And then you give away the minimum ground needed each time to hold on to as much challenge, hold on to as much complexity, hold on to as much operating at your threshold on the brink of your comfort zone. Because when you are challenging yourself in that way, there's so much, you're not just strengthening your musculature, but all those neurological components, which Trevor mentioned, of the coordination, accuracy, agility, and balance. Those come from doing complicated things in which your brain has to think about what your body is doing in it. And it requires sequencing and a proper, quarter extremity. And, if we're all working out in our 20s, 30s, all the way to our 70s, 80s, and 90s, yes, we're going to give up some of that ground, some of that movements. The squat snatch will eventually go away in favor of something else. But whatever you do, when you give that movement away, you should try to replicate it with as close as you can, not only from the movement pattern, but the technical challenge, the physical challenge. Don't just go right to the most dumbed down, simple version. You're doing yourself or your athlete and your body and mind a huge disservice, in my opinion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, to use a word I've used in the past, it's seductive sometimes to think that really the most important attribute is to just keep moving, get my heart and lungs pumping, and that's enough to do you. It's not a bad thing. It's certainly going to have an effect.
Lapping everybody on the couch.
Absolutely. However, it falls right back into an analogous behavior as the bodybuilder of old, the old Nautilus routine where you're sitting there on these pre-selectorized machines. There's no neurological challenge whatsoever because everything's guided and on rails. And it's like, sure, you have some basic physiological response, but it's much, much different than when you actually have to control things, including your body through space. And so if we think about jumping as kind of its own category of movement, you can kind of break it down and follow the bouncing ball. And I'll try to frame this in kind of CrossFit terminology, but jumping is by nature explosive. You cannot jump unexplosively. That's not a jump. You won't break
Can't jump slowly.
Exactly. You're not going to break the gravitational pull of the earth and you won't leave the ground. And definitively, it's not a jump. So you try it. You cannot do it slowly. So it's explosive by its very nature. And so if we think about explosive, really what we're saying is the attribute that we're really training here is power, if we're thinking about the 10 general physical skills. And power on that list is a little bit different than when we talk about the average power that's sustained over a workout. Power, looked at as an individual characteristic, is the athlete's ability to rapidly produce force. So how many muscle and motor units, muscle fibers and motor units can I recruit quickly to explosively apply to the task at hand? And we know that from that kind of CrossFit Level 1 theory that power is going to have a lot of neurological components for that reason. In order to get all of those motor units within the muscle firing in unison at once, that's a very difficult thing to do neurologically compared to taking time to ramp up the tension and apply it more slowly and more steadily, like something in, say, a deadlift or a squat. So there's much more, a greater neurological component and therefore much more skill involved with the concept of jumping. And so for that reason, it's really not the same thing as other types of strength. You could argue that lifting kind of in the Olympic style is analogous for many of those same reasons, but it's still not quite the same thing. So it's one of those categories of movement that I believe needs to be preserved on its own and trained as such. I don't think it's something that you can just forget about and say, good enough to step over. Good enough for some things. If you just need to get the workout in and that's what's getting it done for the day, fine. But don't discard it as a skill because of all these benefits that we just talked about. So yeah, really, really important that people consider that.
I also think that it's one of those movements, again, if we follow the trail of breadcrumbs and maintaining as much complexity and challenge as possible, that speaks to capacity somewhere else. And you mentioned it with doing the Nautilus routine, right? Where, Greg, Glassman always used to say that you could have somebody, like you said, later in years, I'm so happy that you're just moving, right? But we're not squatting, but we're replicating the squat by doing a leg extension, a leg curl. Maybe, there's no weight on the leg press machine, but you do some like eighth range of motion, quarter range of motion leg presses there. I've got no idea if that person can actually come from a seated to a standing position on their own, based upon that routine. But if I have somebody, regardless of the weight, heck, they're just doing air squats at that same age, later in life, and they can still do a small handful of air squats, that's so much more useful, beneficial, and speaks more to their real world functionality, capacity, independent living, all of that. that one actual, because they increase the complexity, they increase the technical ability, they require balance, they require a great range of motion, coordination, a sequencing, they have to engage their brain with their body that you're not getting when you simplify the movement, even though, yes, you are replicating the range of motion, but the two are not equals. And so I kind of think of, if I knew that somebody from a certain age, there was an athlete I just had recently who was in their 60s and just this woman PR'd her box jump. She was still getting after it. And she PR'd her box jump at something like 30 inches for one time. I don't know anything else about that woman. Okay. I know she's probably not clinically obese, is going to be a guess that I'm going to throw out there. And I bet she doesn't have a tough time going up and down a flight of stairs. Without ever seeing her in any way, shape, or form, there's just certain things that assertions you can make that I couldn't make if I said, hey, this woman in her mid to late 70s, she just, I don't know, did this in the leg extension or the leg curl. I'll be like, oh, great. I don't really know what else she's capable of. But you tell me she's got a 30-inch box jump. I'm like, yeah, holy cow, that's crazy. And so I think some of those things lend themselves more readily to being quite useful. And jumping is one of those things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think that people forget sometimes that physiologically, if you strip it down to those type of terms, there are different tissues that respond differently to that kind of rapid loading and rapid absorption of force. So, for example, on the landing, now you have to be aware that obviously it's higher impact, and you need to manage the volume appropriately, especially in the beginning, and the height and the intensity. However, it's really, really useful for certain tissues of the body to be exposed to that kind of rapid creation of force and the rapid absorption of force when the repetition is over. So, again, for that reason, it's a different fundamental thing than just adding a little bit more weight to the bar or just getting around the object in whatever fashion that you can. So yeah, Trevor, I think you're on the money, my friend. Keep fighting the good fight and keep jumps alive in your program.
And it's kind of one of those things, you don't ever want to be dismissive with somebody's question, right? Because everyone's at somewhere different in their fitness journey, not only working out, but in their potentially understanding of the human body and physiology. And I must admit, I was working out for years and years and years in a global gym setting before I first sat down my first level 1. And so after working out for decades, of course, I thought I knew it all. I'd read, the encyclopedia of bodybuilding and all this stuff. And until, Glassman said something about the transference of a squat, versus breaking it down to its simplified parts, and you can't rebuild the squat and things like that, I was like, oh, in all my years of doing those movements and working out, I never pieced that together in my head. So again, some of these things might be really obvious to us or to Trevor, but potentially are genuine questions from that person as to like, I don't see why you want me to do this. I don't get it all. Because when I see this question after so many years of CrossFit, I think to myself, well, man, jumping. If you're young, the benefits of jumping and being explosive should be so blatantly obvious to why they're beneficial and supporting athleticism that it shouldn't even need explanation. And then as you get older, if you can do that, you're in a class of superhumans that your peers aren't in. So that almost seems super obvious as well. But then I have to rewind myself and say, it's only obvious now to me 17 years into this CrossFit journey. But when I sat in my level 1 seat, it was not obvious to me in any way, shape, or form. And I most certainly needed somebody to slowly click that light on in my head. And then I kind of looked at the world through a different set of glasses when it came to how I had been working out. What were the actual demands of real life? When somebody explained to me that a deadlift was just picking anything up off the ground, I was like, oh yeah, like you can't avoid that no matter what you think about the deadlift. Life forces you to deadlift, or forces you to squat. And so some of those things that, again, are old hat to veteran CrossFitters, it can be great to pass that information along to somebody else, and then they've got it and they can answer somebody else's question as well.
Yeah, for sure. And to follow up a little bit on your comment about, if I have somebody who's an older athlete and they can demonstrate a pretty good box jump, I know a lot about them even without much more investigation. To that point, I think it's also important to remember that I'm going to generalize a little bit here, but most people's training priorities change when they get past a certain age. And adding another 10 pounds to the bar becomes a little less important for most of us. Now, that it can still be motivating for a lot of people, sure. But by and large, once you get past a certain age, I believe that most people's priority becomes, how do I feel in my day-to-day life? What am I capable of outside of the gym? What does the body feel like as I make my way through activities that I'm doing outside of the gym? And to bolster your point, I would argue that anybody who's of an advanced age that can also demonstrate a box jump like the one you talked about probably feels pretty good about the way that they are navigating their environment on a regular basis.
Right.
The same may not be true for that same aged athlete who just has a monster deadlift and doesn't have some of these other skills to show for it. That monster deadlift that's great. That's a great achievement. And it's certainly a piece of the fitness puzzle. However, I don't think it's going to have as much carryover to the navigation of the tasks and trials of everyday life. And therefore, it may be less of a priority, even though it's an easier thing to kind of see and achieve, because there's a linear nature to it that isn't often as explored with something like jumping.
And if anybody, Trevor seems to know what he's talking about quite well, but if anybody wants to dive into this stuff a bit more, because we spoke about power in this application, and this power as it relates to the 10 general physical skills. Trevor brought up the coordination, accuracy, agility, and balance. We spoke about how those are neurological, blah, blah, blah. If anybody wants to dive into those, we did a whole show on those. If you want to go back and check it out, it was Very Not Random number 32. We talked about the 10 general physical skills. You can go totally down that rabbit hole for a full show if you so desire. It's a cool, if we are kind of, I think we might be wrapping it up here, but what's a cool jump story is Michelle Moots, who we had on the show a while ago. And she, used to do at CrossFit HQ, and potentially she still does, the training of population of athletes, of not only older athletes with, chronic disease or illness, very heavy athletes, the whole 9 yards. And she had so many great stories. And there was one woman she had who was quite heavy, and her goal was to get back some functional independence, to lose some weight, get her, start getting her life back on track. And Michelle worked with this woman for months and months and months, and eventually worked her up to the point where she did a jump over a chalk line on the floor. That was it. Just jump from one side of a chalk line on the floor to the other. And one day, it was the first day where it wasn't kind of a step, like a 1 foot, 2 foot. Like she actually left with 2 feet. Both feet were off the ground at the same time. And then she landed just on the other side of this chalk line. And when she landed on the other side, Michelle said they just broke into tears. And this woman said something along the lines of, that was the first time both of her feet had been off the ground at the same time in over a decade of her life. Yeah. And so again, and that's how it all starts, right? Again, depending upon where somebody is. And then if that woman stuck with that and kept, doing the right things in the kitchen and showing up to the gym and making good decisions, that chalk line could eventually be jumping onto a 25-pound bumper plate that's a 1/2 inch in diameter. And then the next goal is the 45-pound plate, which is about an inch, inch and a half in diameter. And then it's this crawl, walk, run approach. And those are huge, huge. Again, it's not all, I brought up a 30-inch box jump for that woman, which is so impressive. But again, depending upon where you are, that jumping onto a 25-pound plate could have been life-changing for an athlete. So, try to get your athletes jumping, try to make some good decisions, and hopefully educate them as to why it's wonderfully beneficial to have in their training.
Yeah, you nailed it. I have nothing more to add on that. So Trevor, keep doing what you're doing, my man. And hopefully you've got a little bit more ammunition as far as strategy to approach this with your athlete. I hope that is helpful to you. And like I said, I think the best approach is just trying to get in there and get your hands dirty with that athlete and then convince them later.
I would say the best approach is just tell them to do the darn thing.
That's right. Yep. in a caring way, in a way that's supportive.
I'm joking. Somebody's going to run with that. Like, that's what they told me to do. Very not random. Just do it. That's right, yeah. Once again, Trevor, appreciate the question, my friend. As we always say, anybody out there that has a question, a topic, you think maybe we should interview somebody, post it in the comments on the BTWB YouTube channel. Find the show. Let us know what you think. If you've got thoughts on the topic of jumping in general, scaling, modifications, the benefits, some cool success stories, please let us know. As we always say at the end as well, check out the VNR cycles if you'd like to help support the show. Whole bunch of different cycles, from want to get your first pull-up, you want to learn how to walk on your hands, you want to get some toes to bar, got some stuff in there for barbells as well. There's some really cool programs. We hope that you enjoy them. For Adrian Bosman, I'm Pat Sherwood, and we'll see you next time.